How is this even possible? The words echoed in Sophia's mind, a whirlwind of confusion and terror clouding her thoughts. Her body was trembling, her heart racing in her chest. She could barely breathe through the cloth shoved in her mouth, and her arms were bound so tightly that the ropes seemed to cut into her skin with every small movement. Her eyes were covered with a blindfold, and every step she took felt like it was pulling her further away from everything she had known. The sounds of men's rough voices echoed around her as they dragged her down a dirt path. Each step felt heavier, and with each one, the hope that had once existed in her heart began to fade into nothingness. Sophia had never imagined this would happen. She had always dreamed of something better, something far away from the dust and struggle of her village. A new job, a new life. When the stranger had approached her in the market, offering work in the city, it felt like a chance to escape the life she knew. But it had all been a lie. The promise of a better future was just a trap, and now she was paying the price. The grip of the men around her was unyielding, their hands rough and cold. She struggled to keep calm, fighting back the panic that was rising within her chest. She kept thinking of her family, her mother's warm smile, her father's comforting voice. It felt like a lifetime ago, like they were all part of a different life. How could everything change so fast? They finally stopped, and she was shoved into a dark, cold room. The door slammed shut behind her, and the sound echoed like a death sentence. The quiet after the noise was deafening, and all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The traffickers' cruel laughter echoed through the walls, but it didn't matter now. They would come for her soon. They would sell her like they had done with so many others before her. She was just another piece of merchandise, a commodity in their cruel game. She had no hope left. But as the night wore on, something deep within her refused to let go. She kept thinking of the stars outside, and a part of her clung to the belief that there might still be a way out. Miles away, deep in the jungle, a different story was unfolding. Khan, a police dog with a history of overcoming hardships, stood still, his sharp nose twitching. The scent was faint but unmistakable, the unmistakable trace of human trafficking. The air around him was thick with tension, and the forest felt unnervingly quiet. His handler, Officer Dara, stood beside him, his hand gently resting on the dog's back. He trusted Khan with his life. Together, they had faced danger before, but tonight felt different. For the past few days, they had been following the scent trail of the traffickers who had been operating in the area. Khan was known for his impeccable tracking skills, no scent could escape him. But tonight, something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, something Khan had never experienced before. It was as if time itself had slowed down. Officer Dara could feel the unease in the dog, and it made him anxious. Khan let out a low growl and began moving forward, his nose pressed to the ground. Dara followed, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no time to waste. They were close. They had to be. The traffickers wouldn't get away this time. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the jungle. Khan's paws moved swiftly and silently through the underbrush. Dara followed closely behind, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He trusted Khan's instincts completely. The dog had never led him wrong. As they neared the clearing, Khan suddenly stopped. His ears pricked up, and his body tensed. Dara froze, eyes scanning the area. He could hear it now too, a faint sound, a distant noise coming from the direction of an old, dilapidated warehouse. It was a girl's voice, soft but desperate. Khan barked, and Dara's heart skipped a beat. The dog had found something. It wasn't just a trail. It was a person. Sophia sat in her small, dark room, her legs pulled tightly to her chest, her mind spinning. What was happening? What was she supposed to do? The traffickers were busy, making plans to move her to another place, but the fear in her heart was louder than anything else. She didn't know how much time had passed. She was running on empty, her body weak, her eyes fighting sleep. Suddenly, the sound of barking shattered the silence. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Was that a dog? No. It couldn't be. She tried to strain her ears, but the only thing she could hear was the pounding of her own pulse. The barking continued, closer this time, and she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever, hope. Was it possible? Could someone be coming for her? Outside the warehouse, Khan's nose was working overtime. The scent of fear was overwhelming, mixed with the lingering scent of the traffickers. He whined softly, urging Dara forward. There was no time to waste. Every second counted. Dara's hands gripped his flashlight tightly as he advanced cautiously. The dog was right. Someone was in there. Someone in danger. Sophia's heart raced as she heard the bark again, this time closer than before. She couldn't believe it. She wanted to believe it was a dream, but the sound was too real. Could it be? Could it really be someone coming for her? Khan was getting closer, every step bringing him nearer to the source of the scent. Dara was right behind him, his senses on high alert. This wasn't just another case, it felt personal. Something deep inside Dara told him that this girl, this victim, was different. The door to the warehouse creaked as Officer Dara gently pushed it open, his breath held tight in his chest. Khan moved silently ahead, his body low to the ground, every muscle tense, every step calculated. He knew what he had to do. The scent was strong now, stronger than anything he had tracked before. It was fear, pure and raw. The dog's instincts told him that the girl was close, but there was no telling what else was inside that dark room. Inside, Sophia heard the door creak too. She flinched, her heart hammering in her chest. Could it be them, coming to hurt her again? Or was it something else? Something better? The barking had gotten louder, and now she could hear footsteps. Someone was close. She tried to shift her position, but the ropes were too tight. Her wrists burned as she twisted them, and the cold, bitter metal of despair gripped her heart. If this was a trap, she wouldn't survive it. But what if it wasn't? What if this was her chance? Her only chance? Khan stopped at the entrance to the room, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Dara crouched behind him, his eyes scanning the shadows. He could hear the faint sound of someone moving inside, someone struggling, someone trying to escape. "Stay close, Khan," Dara whispered, his voice a low murmur. The dog's tail wagged once, but he didn't move. His eyes were locked on the room in front of them. Dara knew what that meant. Khan had found something important. This wasn't just a case of following a scent. This was life or death. As Dara slowly approached, the room came into sharper focus. It was dimly lit, with only a single, flickering light hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled stale, tinged with a metallic scent that made his stomach twist. And then he saw her. A girl, huddled in the corner, her body trembling with fear. Her hands were tied, her face pale and tear-streaked. Sophia didn't know who this person was. She didn't know what they would do to her. All she knew was that the barking had stopped. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't comforting. Her heart thudded in her chest as she heard someone approaching. And then she heard it, the voice. It was gentle, low, reassuring. "It's okay, we're here to help." Sophia didn't believe it at first. Her eyes searched the man's face, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this another trick? Another lie? But then she saw the dog, Khan, standing proudly at the man's side, his eyes watching her with a strange intensity. There was no hostility in those eyes, no cruelty. Just loyalty. Officer Dara moved closer, but not too close. He knew the danger of rushing things. The girl was scared, no, terrified. The last thing she needed was someone forcing their way into her space. He knelt down slowly, careful to keep his movement steady and calm, trying to show her that he wasn't a threat. "Listen, I'm Officer Dara," he said softly, his voice as steady as he could manage. "This is Khan. We're here to get you out of here." Khan let out a soft whine, his tail wagging gently. Sophia's gaze flicked from the dog back to Officer Dara, the words slowly sinking in. Could it be true? Could this man, and this dog, really be her salvation? Or was this just another moment of false hope before the nightmare began again? Her breath hitched in her throat, her mind racing. She had been promised a new life once before, and it had been nothing more than a lie. Could she trust him? Could she trust the dog? The fear that had once paralyzed her was slowly beginning to shift into something else, something like hope. "Please," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please help me." That was all Dara needed to hear. He didn't waste another second. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small knife and cut the ropes that bound her hands. As the ropes fell away, Sophia rubbed her wrists, her eyes never leaving the dog, who continued to watch her with calm, steady eyes. The moment her hands were free, Dara reached out to her. "We need to go. It's not safe here." Khan stepped forward, his movements slow but purposeful, as if trying to reassure her. Sophia's body tensed at first, but the dog didn't bark, didn't lunge. He simply stood there, looking at her as though he knew what she needed. She took a hesitant step toward the dog, feeling an unexpected warmth in her chest. It was a sign that there was still good in the world. A sign that she wasn't alone. Dara led her toward the door, and Khan stayed close, his protective instincts on high alert. As they stepped outside, the moonlight flooded over them, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the heat of the warehouse. Dara looked around, making sure the area was clear. The traffickers could still be nearby. But in that moment, it didn't matter. They had her. She was alive, and they were getting her out of here. As they moved quickly through the jungle, Sophia stayed close to the dog, feeling safer with each step. The forest seemed to stretch out endlessly, but she wasn't looking for a way out anymore. She was looking for freedom. For the first time in days, she could breathe again. The jungle seemed to press in on them, the night alive with the sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. Sophia's heart was still racing, but with every step she took away from the warehouse, the weight of her fear began to lift. She kept her eyes on Khan, the dog who had saved her from the brink of despair. He was still by her side, his presence comforting in ways she couldn't explain. His thick fur brushed against her leg, offering a silent promise that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. Dara led the way, his movements sharp and deliberate, scanning their surroundings. He had been trained for situations like this, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a job, it was personal. Sophia wasn't just another victim, they were all human, but there was something about her, something in the way she had looked at him with such raw vulnerability, that made him even more determined to get her to safety. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the path became more difficult. The thick foliage made it harder to see, and the ground beneath their feet was uneven, sometimes slick with dew or mud. Sophia stumbled once, but Khan was there immediately, nudging her with his nose and helping steady her. The simple act of the dog's support made her feel like she wasn't alone, as if, for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what's going on. I don't understand how this happened." Dara slowed down, glancing back at her. The truth was, he didn't fully understand it either. The whole situation felt like it was moving too fast, and the pieces weren't quite fitting together. They had received a tip about a human trafficking operation in the area, but this girl, Sophia, she didn't fit the typical profile. She was young, yes, but there was something more to her. She wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes kept darting around, searching for any sign of danger. "I know it's hard," Dara said softly, trying to reassure her. "But you're safe now. We're getting you out of here." Sophia nodded, though it didn't feel real. Her mind was still trapped in the nightmare of the past few days, the memories of the traffickers, their cold eyes, their rough hands, and their cruel words. She could still feel the ropes cutting into her skin, the terror of not knowing what would happen next. The darkness of the warehouse had felt like it would swallow her whole. And now, here she was, running through the jungle, following a man she didn't know, and a dog who seemed to know more about safety than she did. But the feeling of hope was still there, growing ever stronger with each step. A sudden sound stopped them in their tracks. A branch snapped in the distance, the noise sharp and out of place in the quiet of the night. Dara immediately signaled for them to stop. Khan's ears perked up, his body tensing as he growled low in his throat. Dara crouched down, motioning for Sophia to stay behind him. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "We need to listen." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. Was it them? The traffickers? Had they found them already? The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, muffled but unmistakable. Dara's eyes scanned the shadows, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. Khan was already moving, his nose working overtime, trying to catch the scent of the intruder. The footsteps grew louder, and Dara's grip tightened on his flashlight. "Stay low," he instructed, moving behind a thick cluster of trees. "Don't make a sound." Sophia nodded, her body instinctively sinking to the ground behind a bush. She held her breath, every muscle tense as she waited for what would happen next. Her mind raced with fear. She had come so far. Could she really lose her chance at freedom now? The sound of footsteps was almost upon them. Dara's hand moved to his gun, his fingers steady despite the pressure. Khan, however, wasn't waiting for any command. With a sudden, sharp bark, he leaped forward, darting out of the shadows. The movement was so fast that Sophia didn't even have time to process it. In an instant, Khan was on the ground, his paws outstretched, his nose sniffing the air, and his ears perked. Dara was on his heels, his flashlight swinging forward to reveal the figure standing just a few yards away. It was a man. Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in recognition. She knew that face. She had seen him before. One of the traffickers. The one who had first promised her a better life in the city. Dara didn't hesitate. His voice was firm and commanding as he aimed his weapon at the man. "Don't move." The trafficker froze, his eyes darting nervously between Dara and the dog. He didn't know how much Dara knew, but he could see the intensity in the officer's eyes. He could see the weapon aimed at his chest. Khan growled low, his body stiff with aggression. The man was no longer a threat to Sophia, not when this dog was standing between them. "Get down on the ground," Dara ordered, his voice cold. The trafficker raised his hand slowly, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew the game was up. For a moment, everything was still. Dara and the trafficker stared at each other in the dim light, while Khan stood guard, his watchful eyes never leaving the man. Sophia stayed hidden, holding her breath, afraid that making a sound might ruin everything. And then, without warning, the man dropped to his knees. "You don't know who you're messing with," he spat, his voice full of venom. But even he knew the game was over. His words were empty, hollow. Officer Dara kept his gun trained on him, but his focus never wavered from the task at hand. They weren't done yet. They still had to get Sophia to safety. But in this moment, it felt like a small victory. The trafficker, the monster who had torn apart her life, was finally powerless. Sophia remained silent, her breath shaky, her eyes locked on Khan, the dog who had guided them to this moment of safety. She had never imagined something like this could happen to her, but it was real. She was free. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of her fear began to lift. But she wasn't out of danger yet. There was still so much more ahead. The night was far from over, and as much as Sophia wanted to believe that the worst was behind her, the reality was different. The trafficker knelt in front of Officer Dara, hands raised in submission, but that didn't mean they were safe. Not yet. Not while the rest of his group could be lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Dara kept his eyes on the man, his grip steady on the gun, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew this wasn't over. He had to keep Sophia moving, get her to safety, and make sure she was out of harm's reach. The traffickers were part of a bigger operation, and if one of them had followed them this far into the jungle, there was a chance others were close by. And if they came looking for their colleague, it wouldn't be just Dara and Khan they'd be facing. Sophia's heart raced as she peered out from behind the bushes. She couldn't understand how all of this had happened so fast. The events of the last few hours felt like they were happening in a dream, one she couldn't wake up from. She had been trapped, powerless, and now she was running through the jungle with a police officer and a dog, both of them her unlikely saviors. But fear still gripped her, wrapping itself around her chest like a vice. She kept thinking about her family, about her mother, her father, who must have been frantic with worry. Would they ever know she was okay? Khan, sensing the distress in her, took a step closer to her. His body was low to the ground, his gaze never leaving the trafficker. The dog's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos around them, and Sophia couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. Khan wasn't just a dog. He was a protector, and she could feel that deep in her bones. Dara shifted his attention to Sophia, noticing how she was still crouched behind the bushes, her eyes wide, her breathing uneven. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm but gentle, as he slowly holstered his gun. "Stay close. And don't look back." Sophia nodded, her legs trembling as she pushed herself to her feet. Khan immediately stood by her side, his tail wagging once before he gently nudged her forward. She took a deep breath and, despite the fear that still gripped her heart, she trusted the dog. If Khan believed she was safe, then maybe, just maybe, she could believe it too. They began walking again, but this time, it was slower. Dara led the way with Khan by his side, constantly scanning the area for any sign of danger. Sophia followed behind, her heart still pounding, but with a growing sense of hope. She was walking away from the nightmare, not running yet, but steadily moving forward. She was still afraid, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she could see a sliver of light at the end of the tunnel. As they continued through the jungle, the silence felt heavy. Dara's mind raced as he thought of the best way to get Sophia to safety. The authorities were still miles away, and it was unlikely they could reach the nearest station before the traffickers realized they were missing one of their own. The only way they could ensure Sophia's safety was to keep moving, stay hidden, and hope the traffickers wouldn't find them. But Dara wasn't naive. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. The traffickers wouldn't stop at just one failed attempt. They would come after her. They would hunt her down, and if they caught up with them. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. No, he wasn't going to let that happen. Not tonight. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything had gone quiet. No sounds of danger. No signs of the traffickers. The air smelled earthy and cool, and the path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the jungle was opening up to offer them a safe passage. Dara couldn't help but wonder if this was fate, if this was some kind of sign that they were going to make it out alive. But then a crack in the distance shattered the calm. It was distant at first, but then it grew louder, a crash of branches, the unmistakable sound of footsteps running through the forest. Dara's heart sank. They were coming. The traffickers were close. Too close. Without missing a beat, Dara pulled Sophia closer to him. "Run," he said urgently. "We can't stay here. Get to the trees, stay low." Khan barked, sensing the danger, and immediately took off running ahead, his tail straight and his body low to the ground. Dara followed, pulling Sophia with him. Her legs were weak, her body exhausted, but the urgency in Dara's voice spurred her forward. She had no choice but to trust him. Khan was already ahead, darting through the thick underbrush, guiding the way. As they raced through the jungle, the sound of the traffickers' pursuit grew louder. The footsteps were no longer a distant echo. They were close. Too close. Dara could hear them shouting, cursing as they tried to catch up, and it made his pulse spike. But Khan was leading them, moving like a shadow in the night. He darted through the trees with a grace that was almost unnatural, as if the jungle itself was guiding him. Dara followed, his breath coming fast as he pushed himself harder. Sophia, though terrified, followed Khan's lead, trusting that the dog knew the way. They had to outrun them. They had to stay ahead. The seconds felt like minutes. The minutes felt like hours. Every sound around them was amplified, the pounding of their feet against the earth, the snap of twigs underfoot, the frantic rustling of leaves as they sprinted through the thick jungle. The traffickers' voices were now unmistakable, their shouts echoing through the night, but they were falling behind. Dara could tell they weren't used to running this fast, this far. They were losing ground. But they weren't out of danger yet. The only way to survive was to keep running, keep moving, keep trusting Khan. And for the first time, Sophia allowed herself to hope. To believe that there was a chance. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to make it out alive. The jungle around them grew thicker, the trees becoming a dense wall of shadows and branches, as if nature itself was trying to hide them. Sophia's breath was ragged, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The traffickers were still out there, and the sound of their voices echoed in the distance, growing fainter with every second that passed. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Dara knew that. He could hear the anger in their shouts, the frustration as they realized they were losing ground. Khan was ahead of them, darting between the trees with swift, silent movements. His instincts were leading them, he could smell danger and knew exactly where to go. Dara trusted him implicitly. Every time Sophia stumbled or hesitated, Khan was there, nudging her forward, offering silent reassurance. The dog was their guide, their protector, and in that moment, he was the only thing that made Sophia feel truly safe. Dara kept looking back, his senses on high alert. He knew the traffickers had the advantage in numbers. But they didn't have Khan. And that made all the difference. "Keep moving, Sophia," Dara urged, his voice strained. He grabbed her hand, pulling her along as the ground beneath their feet became even more treacherous, the underbrush thickening around them. "I'm trying," she panted, her legs threatening to buckle. She was exhausted. Her body was aching, her muscles burning from the effort. But there was no time to stop. If they stopped, the traffickers would catch up to them. And that thought was enough to keep her going, even though every step felt like it might be her last. The sound of pursuit was still there, but it was growing more distant. The traffickers were no longer right behind them. Dara allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They had gained some ground. But that didn't mean they were safe. Not by a long shot. The jungle seemed to swallow them whole as they continued deeper into the woods. Dara had no clear plan. He was improvising, following the path of least resistance, hoping it would lead them to somewhere safe. He didn't dare to look at his watch, knowing they had been running for what felt like hours. His legs were heavy, his breath shallow, but he pushed forward. Khan was still ahead, always staying just far enough to guide them without leaving them behind. Sophia, despite her exhaustion, stayed close to the dog. She wasn't sure what it was about Khan. Maybe it was the way he had protected her from the trafficker earlier, or maybe it was the way he seemed to know exactly where to go, but she trusted him more than she had ever trusted anyone before. He had become her symbol of hope, her strength when she had none left. They moved through the thick foliage, ducking under branches and jumping over fallen logs. Every time Sophia stumbled, Khan was there, nudging her along. The connection between them was undeniable. For a girl who had lost everything, whose world had been turned upside down by cruelty and pain, this dog was her anchor. Her reminder that not all was lost. Not yet. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke the silence again. Close. Too close. Dara's heart skipped a beat. He knew it. The traffickers weren't far behind. He grabbed Sophia's arm, pulling her into the cover of the trees. He motioned for Khan to stay low and quiet, the dog obeying without hesitation. Dara's breath was shallow, his chest tightening with the adrenaline rushing through his veins. They had no time. If they didn't move now, the traffickers would find them. He scanned the area quickly, eyes darting from one shadow to another. They couldn't stay here. But where could they go? It was then that he saw it, a faint glow in the distance. A small break in the trees where the jungle opened up. He didn't hesitate. "We're going that way," Dara whispered urgently to Sophia. He didn't know what lay ahead, but it was their only option. The traffickers wouldn't stop searching. He needed to get them out of the jungle and into a place where they could regroup. Somewhere they could get help. With a quick glance toward Khan, Dara motioned for him to lead the way. The dog was already in motion, moving swiftly toward the light in the distance. Sophia didn't question it. She just followed, her legs burning, but the instinct to survive was stronger than the pain. The glow grew brighter, and soon, Dara could see what it was, a small clearing, a broken-down cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was secluded, hidden by the thick jungle that surrounded it, and it was their only hope of evading the traffickers for the moment. But it wasn't safe. Not by a long shot. It was a temporary refuge, nothing more. But it had to be enough. Dara stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. He motioned for Sophia to crouch down beside him, pulling her close to the tree trunk. Khan stood by, his body tense and alert. "Stay here," Dara whispered, his voice low. "I'll check it out. If it's clear, we'll move in. Stay quiet." Sophia nodded, barely able to speak. She was too scared, too drained to argue. But the promise of safety, even if just for a moment, was enough to keep her still. Dara made his way to the cabin, moving with the stealth of a seasoned officer. His eyes never left the shadows, his ears tuned to every sound. Khan followed close behind, his presence a constant reassurance. Sophia watched from a distance, her heart thudding in her chest as she waited for Dara's signal. The cabin looked abandoned, but Dara wasn't about to take any chances. He checked the door, cautiously turning the handle. It creaked, but it opened. Dara stepped inside, his gun at the ready. The room was small and dusty, with broken furniture scattered across the floor. There was no sign of life. He motioned for Sophia to come over, and she followed quickly, her feet stumbling slightly as she ran toward the cabin. Khan entered first, his body low to the ground, ever vigilant. They were safe, for now. But Dara knew that peace was fleeting. The traffickers would be coming, and soon. He had to get them out of the jungle, to the nearest authorities, before the nightmare started again. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia felt a strange calm settle over her. She was alive. She was free. And with Dara, and Khan, by her side, she finally had a chance to rebuild her life. The jungle, dark and unforgiving, had swallowed her whole once. But now, it was just a backdrop to her story of survival. And as long as she kept running, as long as she kept fighting, she knew she could make it. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with dust, the remnants of forgotten years hanging in the stale atmosphere. It felt surreal to Sophia, as if her body had finally reached a point where it couldn't believe she was no longer in immediate danger. But the truth was far from that. She knew better than to let her guard down. The traffickers were still out there, and they wouldn't rest until they found her. Dara had already moved to the window, peering out cautiously. His expression was unreadable, his mind clearly working overtime as he assessed their situation. Khan had settled down in the corner of the room, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never stopped scanning for any hint of danger. Sophia could feel the tension in the air, like a pressure that was about to break, and it made her want to curl up and hide from the world outside. "Are you okay?" Dara's voice broke through the silence, calm but concerned. He turned away from the window to look at her. His eyes softened for a moment, and Sophia realized just how much he was trying to hold it together for both of them. She nodded, though the truth was, she felt far from okay. Her legs trembled from exhaustion, her skin still burned from the ropes that had cut into her wrists, and her heart raced with the ghost of the fear that had plagued her since she'd been taken. But she wasn't about to break down. Not now. She had survived this far. She owed it to herself to keep going. "I don't know how much longer we can stay here," Dara continued, his voice steady as ever. "We need to keep moving. I'm not sure how much time we have before they realize we've disappeared. The best thing we can do is get out of here and get you to safety, far away from this place." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "But where will we go? How do we get away from them?" Dara looked back out the window, his jaw tightening. "We'll head to the nearest village. We'll alert the authorities, and they'll be able to help you. But we need to move fast." Her heart dropped into her stomach. The village was still a long distance away. If the traffickers were looking for them, they could intercept them at any moment. The path to safety was far from certain, and Sophia couldn't shake the image of the traffickers finding them before they reached help. They were out there, somewhere, hunting for her. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, stifling her breath. Suddenly, Khan lifted his head, his ears twitching. His body stiffened, and Dara turned, sensing the change in the dog's behavior. "Stay here," he whispered sharply, crouching to pick up his weapon. "Keep quiet, Sophia." Sophia didn't need to be told twice. She moved into the farthest corner of the cabin, crouching low behind a half-broken table. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to control her breathing, but it was hard to stay calm when every fiber of her being screamed that danger was near. Dara moved with calculated precision, stepping silently toward the door. His eyes never left Khan, who was now standing alert, his muscles coiled. The dog's instincts were sharp. Something was wrong. The silence outside felt oppressive, the weight of the night pressing in on them. Every second stretched out, and Sophia felt like she was suffocating in the tension. Then, a sudden sound, a snap of a twig, barely audible, came from outside. Khan immediately growled low, a sound of warning, and Dara's hand tightened around the handle of his gun. He motioned for Khan to stay back, and the dog obeyed, but his eyes remained fixed on the door. Dara's voice was low, barely a whisper. "Stay inside." No matter what happens, don't come out unless I say so. Sophia nodded, though every instinct in her wanted to run to him, to make sure he was safe. But she knew that staying hidden was their only chance now. The traffickers had to be close. They were closing in, and they wouldn't hesitate to make their move. Dara moved to the door, carefully pushing it open just enough to peer outside. His eyes scanned the perimeter, searching the shadows. Khan stood still beside him, every muscle tense, every hair on his back raised. The air was thick with anticipation. The sound came again, louder this time, footsteps, deliberate and heavy. Someone was close. Dara didn't hesitate. He stepped into the doorway, his eyes scanning the area. Khan moved with him, the two of them working like a well-trained team. The traffickers were close. Dara could feel it in his gut. He couldn't risk them getting too close to the cabin. Not when Sophia was inside, vulnerable and alone. Just then, a figure emerged from the trees, moving cautiously, his eyes darting in every direction. He was one of them. A trafficker. And there was no mistaking the gun strapped to his belt. Dara's breath caught in his throat, and he didn't think twice. His voice was low, but firm, as he called out to the man. "Stop right there." The trafficker froze. His eyes widened, recognizing the officer standing before him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the man slowly raised his hands, a smirk curling on his lips. "You really think you can stop us?" The trafficker's voice was cold, mocking. "You're in our territory now, officer. You can't save her." Dara's eyes narrowed. "You've lost. It's over." But the trafficker wasn't done yet. Without warning, he reached for his gun. But Khan was faster. The dog launched himself forward with a terrifying snarl, knocking the trafficker to the ground with the force of his weight. Dara was right behind him, his gun aimed and ready. The trafficker struggled, but Khan held him down, his teeth bared, his growls deep and menacing. Dara was quick, his hand steady as he moved to disarm the man, kicking the gun out of his reach. In seconds, the trafficker was subdued, pinned to the ground by Khan. Dara stood over him, his eyes filled with anger and resolve. "You will not hurt anyone again," Dara said, his voice cold. He motioned for Khan to release the man, stepping back as he kept his gun trained on him. "Stay down." The trafficker glared at him, but he knew better than to try anything. Dara had won. Khan had won. For a brief moment, it felt like the tension had broken. But the battle wasn't over. They still had a long way to go before they were truly safe. Sophia, hidden in the cabin, was still waiting, still holding her breath, still unsure if this nightmare was truly coming to an end. Dara's eyes were fixed on the trafficker, watching every subtle movement, every flicker of defiance in his eyes. But there was something more pressing than this victory. The reality of their situation was still heavy on Dara's chest. The trafficker was won, and the group had to be somewhere nearby. If they didn't get out soon, this moment of reprieve would be shattered. He glanced toward the cabin, where Sophia was hidden, her fate still tied to his every decision. Dara didn't know her story in full, but what he knew was enough. She'd been taken, used, and now it was his job to make sure she stayed free. No one else would do it. Not the authorities who couldn't reach them fast enough. Not anyone but him, and the dog that had saved them both. Dara quickly lowered his weapon, his attention shifting from the trafficker to the path ahead. He needed to make a decision. Fast. He gestured for Khan to stay put and slowly approached the restrained man. The dog's stance remained unyielding, his eyes locked on the man's every twitch. Dara crouched down, his voice calm but firm. "Where are the others?" Dara asked, his words crisp and cold, like the blade of a knife. The trafficker, still pinned under Khan's powerful weight, let out a low laugh, the smirk on his face fading into a grimace. "You think you can save her," he sneered. "She's just one piece. There are more of us, and we'll come for you both. You can't outrun us." Dara clenched his fists. This wasn't just about the girl he was trying to save. This was about stopping the whole operation, the network that trafficked innocent lives. They couldn't stop now, not while the threat was still so close. "I don't need to outrun you. I just need to keep you here until the authorities arrive." Dara's voice was colder now, as he stood up, his eyes still on the trafficker. "But if you're smart, you'll tell me where the others are. If you're smart, you'll help her." The trafficker spat on the ground, his face twisted in contempt. "You're wasting your time. We're everywhere. You'll never get to us." Dara didn't waste another second. He turned away, signaling for Khan to step back. "You can keep thinking that. But when the police come, you'll wish you hadn't made your choices." He moved swiftly, retracing his steps toward the cabin. His mind raced with strategies, his eyes alert for any sign of danger. He had to get to Sophia, make sure she was okay, and get her out of there before any more traffickers showed up. His heart was pounding as he reached the door, but his hand froze just before he could open it. Something didn't feel right. The stillness of the air, the silence of the jungle, it all seemed too quiet. Dara's instincts kicked in. He had barely turned around when he heard it, voices in the distance. The traffickers were talking, moving, closing in. He cursed under his breath, his heart sinking as the realization hit him. The others had caught wind of what happened, and they were coming. Not just one or two. A group. They had to be close. It wouldn't be long before they found their fallen comrade, and then the chase would begin again. Dara rushed into the cabin, his eyes locking on Sophia, who was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide, her breath quick and shallow. She'd been waiting, hoping for the all-clear, but Dara knew that hope would be short-lived. "We can't stay here," he said urgently, his voice low and quick. "The others are coming. We have to move now." Sophia barely had time to process the urgency in his voice before Dara was already pulling her up by the arm. Khan stood at the door, his stance protective, ready to follow wherever they went. "We're not safe here anymore. The traffickers will be on us soon," Dara continued as he helped Sophia to her feet, guiding her toward the exit. "I'll lead the way, and Khan will keep us safe." As they moved through the door, Dara's mind was racing. He had no clear path ahead, no sure way of escaping the jungle. But they had to get out, and the longer they waited, the more likely it was the traffickers would find them. They took the path to the left, heading deeper into the jungle, away from the cabin and towards the thickest part of the forest. The dense foliage provided cover, but it also made every step more dangerous. The jungle, once a place of refuge, now felt like a maze, dark, winding, and full of threats around every corner. Khan led the way, his nose to the ground, his movements swift and sure. Dara kept a tight grip on Sophia's hand, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his mind alert to every sound. The fear was palpable, but he didn't have the luxury of time to worry about it. Sophia stumbled a few times, her feet dragging beneath her. She was exhausted, but she kept going. There was no other choice. She was alive, and that was enough to push her forward. After a few more minutes of running, Dara stopped suddenly. His eyes narrowed as he listened. There it was, the faintest sound of footsteps behind them. The traffickers were closer than he had hoped. "We need to hide," Dara whispered urgently. "Now." He looked around quickly, his gaze landing on a thick clump of bushes beside a large tree. Without hesitation, he pulled Sophia toward it. Khan followed, his movements fluid and fast. They crouched low to the ground, holding their breath, praying the traffickers wouldn't spot them. Dara's heart was pounding in his chest, the silence around them feeling suffocating. He could hear the traffickers' voices now, just a few feet away, their words unintelligible but unmistakable. "Stay still," Dara muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Sophia's heart raced. Her eyes were wide with fear as she clutched Dara's hand, praying that they wouldn't be found. Khan, ever watchful, was tense, his body ready to spring into action at the slightest sound. The traffickers passed by them, so close that Sophia could feel her breath catch in her throat. It was like time stood still. Every second stretched into eternity as the men moved past them, unaware of the three figures hidden in the bushes just a few feet away. Dara let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding as the footsteps faded. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had bought themselves a few precious moments. Once the coast was clear, Dara stood up first, his hand still firmly gripping Sophia's. Khan followed, looking back once more to make sure there were no stragglers. Dara quickly scanned the path ahead. "We keep moving," he said, his voice determined. "Stay close. We don't stop until we're out of here." Sophia nodded, her mind racing with fear and relief. They were still alive. They were still free. But they were far from safe. Dara knew they couldn't outrun the traffickers forever. The only thing they had was the dog, their only hope of escape. The journey through the jungle had become a blur of movement and fear. Dara didn't know how long they'd been running, how much time had passed since they first found refuge in the cabin. All he knew was that every step forward was one more step closer to survival, and every minute counted. He could feel the weight of Sophia's hand in his, and though she didn't say a word, he could sense the exhaustion in her grip, the way her body was barely able to keep up. Khan, ever vigilant, was ahead of them again, his nose to the ground, his ears flicking at every sound, his body moving with an eerie quietness. The dog had become their guide, their protector, and Dara trusted him more than anything in that moment. The jungle felt suffocating around them, thick, tangled, and unforgiving, but they couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Sophia's breathing was shallow, each step more labored than the last. Dara could see the fatigue in her eyes, the way her limbs seemed to be giving out, but still, she pressed on. She had to. The thought of the traffickers catching up to them kept her moving, one foot in front of the other, even though her body begged her to stop. "You're doing great," Dara said softly, trying to encourage her. His voice was strained, but he meant it. He could see the pain on her face, but the determination in her eyes was undeniable. She was still fighting, and that made him fight harder for her. But the jungle wasn't making it easy. The dense foliage seemed to close in on them at every turn, and the sounds of the traffickers, though distant, still echoed in the air. Dara's nerves were on edge as he tried to focus on the path ahead. He knew they had to be close to the edge of the jungle. They couldn't keep running through this dense forest for much longer. But the village, where they could finally find safety, was still a long way off, and that thought gnawed at him like a weight in his chest. Suddenly, Khan froze, his body tensing. Dara's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, his senses on high alert. The dog's growl was low, a sound so quiet but so filled with warning that it made Dara's heart skip a beat. "Stay down," Dara whispered to Sophia, as he crouched low, his eyes scanning the shadows of the trees. He could hear them now, too, voices, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the air. The traffickers were closer than he thought. Dara's mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest. They couldn't be caught here. They needed cover. They needed to hide. Without hesitation, he grabbed Sophia's arm and pulled her toward a nearby thicket of trees. Khan led the way, his movements swift, his growls growing louder as the men came into view. They were no more than 50 feet away, too close. Dara's breath caught in his throat. He pressed himself and Sophia against the thick trunks of the trees, trying to blend into the shadows, to become part of the jungle itself. The traffickers were talking in low voices, their steps slow and deliberate. It was clear they were searching, looking for any sign of their escaped prisoners. The silence around them felt deafening as the men moved past, so close that Sophia could hear every word, every shift of their feet. Her breath caught in her throat as she held herself as still as possible, her body trembling with fear. Dara's hand was on her arm, steady and reassuring. He knew they couldn't make a sound, not even a breath. He could feel the tension in her body, the way her pulse raced in her neck, but he kept his focus sharp. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The traffickers passed by without noticing them. Dara exhaled slowly, the relief washing over him in a wave. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had managed to stay hidden for just a little while longer. The feeling of fear was still there, lingering, but so was the strength of survival. After a few moments, Dara gently tugged Sophia's arm, signaling for her to follow. Khan led the way once more, moving silently through the trees, as though the jungle was his domain and they were his guests. Dara didn't stop to rest, didn't even think about slowing down. His thoughts were on Sophia, on the mission, on getting out of this alive. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter how hard it got, no matter how much it hurt. The jungle had become a place of both danger and refuge, and only their will to survive would see them through. They pushed forward, one step at a time, hearts beating in sync with the rhythm of their fear, the rhythm of their fight for freedom. But as the traffickers' voices slowly faded into the distance, a new sound took its place, the sound of something much more hopeful, the distant hum of the village. Sophia's heart skipped. She could hear it too. It was the sound of safety, of people, of help. Dara's pace quickened. The village was close. So close. But the traffickers, though temporarily distracted, were not far behind. He knew they had to get to the village before the men realized they'd lost their quarry. Dara's thoughts moved faster than his legs. He couldn't let them get caught now. He couldn't fail her. Not when she had come this far. Not when they were so close to freedom. And then it happened, the snap of a twig, followed by a growl so fierce it shook the air. Khan had sensed something before Dara could even react. In that instant, Dara turned, his eyes scanning for danger, but it was too late. The traffickers had caught up to them. A voice rang out, harsh and commanding. "There they are. Get them!" Dara's heart dropped. It was all coming to a head now, the final moments before everything would be decided. He had one chance, one final move to make. Dara's pulse surged in his veins as the traffickers' shout pierced through the air. The moment they were discovered, everything changed. Time seemed to slow as adrenaline surged through him, every fiber of his being screaming to act fast. There was no more hiding. No more running silently. This was it, the fight for their lives. Sophia's grip on his hand tightened, her wide eyes reflecting the terror that gripped her. She had come so far, endured so much, and now they were at the brink of it all falling apart. Dara glanced over his shoulder at the village, just barely visible through the trees. They were so close, but the traffickers were already closing in, their footsteps heavy on the jungle floor. "Run!" Dara shouted, his voice raw with urgency. He didn't give Sophia a chance to protest. The word was a command, a lifeline. They couldn't afford to wait. He took off in the direction of the village, pulling Sophia along with him. Khan was already ahead, the dog's body cutting through the undergrowth like a shadow, every muscle tensed and ready for action. Sophia stumbled behind him, her breath ragged as fear surged in her chest. She wanted to keep up, to keep running, but her body was betraying her, exhausted from the days of running, of hiding, of constantly being on edge. Her mind screamed for her to keep going, but the physical pain, the ache of every step, made it harder. Then, a sudden burst of movement in front of them stopped her in her tracks. One of the traffickers had emerged from the trees, blocking their path. His eyes locked on them, his grin cruel and twisted. Dara immediately reached for his gun, but before he could draw it, Khan was already on the move. The dog's bark echoed through the jungle, primal and fierce. He lunged at the trafficker, knocking him off his feet with the sheer force of his charge. The trafficker's surprised shout was quickly smothered by the dog's weight, and Khan's jaws found the man's arm, pinning him to the ground. Dara wasted no time. He grabbed Sophia's hand again, pulling her forward, away from the scene. He didn't look back. There was no time to waste on what happened to the trafficker, only forward mattered now. The village was closer, so close he could almost taste it. But just as they neared the clearing, another figure stepped from the shadows. It was a trap. The second trafficker was faster than Dara anticipated. He moved with practiced precision, cutting off their escape. Dara's breath hitched as he saw the man's gun raised. There was no way around him, no time to dodge. "Sophia, stay down!" Dara barked, pushing her behind him. He didn't even have time to aim his own gun before the trafficker fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and for a moment, the world around Dara seemed to slow. But it was Khan, that magnificent, loyal creature, who moved first. In a flash, the dog was between Dara and the bullet, his body slamming into the trafficker's side, sending him crashing into a nearby tree. Dara barely had time to react as Khan's powerful growl filled the air, holding the trafficker at bay. "Go!" Dara shouted, his voice hoarse as he kept his eyes fixed on the man struggling under Khan's weight. "Now, Sophia! Run!" Sophia hesitated, her fear almost paralyzing her. She wanted to stay, to help, but the look in Dara's eyes left no room for argument. They had to get to safety. Dara needed her to be strong for just a little while longer. With a final, desperate glance at Khan and Dara, Sophia turned and ran. The ground beneath her feet seemed to give way with every step, the distance to the village never feeling close enough. But she didn't stop. Her legs burned, and her lungs screamed for air, but she kept running, driven by the single thought of survival. As the jungle began to thin out, the first lights of the village appeared ahead. Her heart surged with hope. It wasn't just a village, it was their salvation. Dara's plan was to reach the people there, to alert them, and to bring in help. But it felt too far still, too many steps before they could be safe. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the struggle continuing. Dara and Khan were holding their ground, but the sound of more footsteps growing closer was unmistakable. They weren't going to give up easily. Sophia's legs wobbled beneath her, but she pushed herself harder. She couldn't stop now. They were almost there. The clearing was just ahead, the first few huts in the village becoming more defined in the moonlight. Her body was giving everything it had left, and then, just as she was about to collapse from exhaustion, a cry rang out from the village. "Help! Someone help!" It was a voice, and it wasn't a trafficker's. Sophia's eyes widened as a man appeared from the shadows. A local villager, a figure she didn't recognize, but he was reaching out to her with an arm wide open, his face filled with urgency. "Come! This way," the man called out, pointing toward a small group of people behind him, all looking just as panicked as she felt. "Quick, before they catch up with you!" Sophia's breath hitched, but she didn't hesitate. She ran straight for the man, her hand grabbing his as he led her into the safety of the village. But the moment she stepped into the circle of light, the weight of her fear hit her. They weren't out of danger yet. As she collapsed into the man's arms, trying to catch her breath, she could hear the faint sounds of the traffickers still chasing. They were too close. The villagers quickly ushered Sophia into one of the homes, a small but sturdy hut. They slammed the door shut behind her, and she collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. The reality of everything she had just endured, the pain, the fear, the escape, crashed over her in waves. Dara wasn't in the hut with her. Her eyes darted around, desperately searching for him. She could only pray that he and Khan had made it to safety as well. Outside, the sound of shouts and more footsteps could be heard, but inside the hut, Sophia felt, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, the briefest moment of peace. But even as she exhaled in relief, she knew it wasn't over. They had come so far, but the battle wasn't finished. Not yet. And when the door to the hut creaked open, Sophia's heart leapt. Would it be Dara? Would it be Khan? Or was danger still looming? The door creaked open, and Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, her entire body tensing as she prepared for whatever might come through the threshold. The moment stretched into eternity as she listened for footsteps, the soft shuffle of movement, the sound of a familiar voice. A shadow appeared in the doorway, blocking the faint moonlight that spilled into the room. Sophia's pulse quickened. It wasn't Dara. The figure was tall, but the body shape was wrong. She instinctively shrank back, her body going rigid, her mind racing with thoughts of the traffickers closing in. But then, the figure stepped fully into the hut, and the soft whimper of a familiar dog filled the air. It was Khan. Sophia's breath caught, relief flooding through her in an instant. She scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady from exhaustion, and rushed toward the dog. Khan, covered in dirt and scratches, limped into the room, his eyes still sharp but his body showing the signs of the fight he'd just endured. But where was Dara? Her heart tightened in her chest as she looked past Khan, her eyes searching the doorway for any sign of him. The man who had kept them alive. The man who had kept his promise. Dara, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. There was no answer, just the steady panting of Khan, the sound of the dog's paws shifting uneasily on the dirt floor. Khan let out a soft growl, his body still tense, his ears flicking as if he were listening for something. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound of Dara coming through the door. Sophia's stomach churned. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Not without Dara. He had brought her this far, and now, when they were so close, he couldn't just disappear. She turned back to the villagers who had ushered her into the hut, their faces concerned, their eyes filled with the weight of the world. One of the men approached her, his face serious but calm. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "We've heard the gunfire. They won't find us here. You are safe." Sophia barely heard him. Her mind was fixated on Dara. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I need to go back. I need to find him." The villagers exchanged glances, their expressions darkening. One of the women spoke up, her voice soft but firm. "It's too dangerous. The traffickers are out there. We can't risk you going back." But Sophia wasn't listening. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let the man who had risked everything for her stay out there alone. Khan's eyes locked with hers, his gaze steady, as though he understood her resolve. She reached down, her hands trembling as she patted his head, trying to steady herself. "Khan, where is Dara?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog looked back toward the door, his growl low but insistent, his body vibrating with the energy of the chase. He knew. He had to know where Dara was. Without another word, Sophia stood up, her legs shaking from fatigue, but the fire in her heart was enough to push her forward. She moved toward the door, and as if on cue, Khan's tail swished behind him. The villagers stepped back, their expressions torn between concern and acceptance. Sophia didn't wait for any more assurances. She couldn't. She had already lost so much. If she let him go now, she would lose Dara too. And that was a price she wasn't willing to pay. "Stay inside," she said to the villagers, her voice determined. "Lock the door. Keep the others safe." One of the villagers tried to stop her, but her eyes were fierce. "Please, I can't stay here. Not without him." She stepped into the night, the cool air hitting her face as Khan led the way, his body already moving swiftly through the shadows. Sophia followed closely, her eyes darting around the village, making sure they were still safe, still hidden. But all her focus was on Dara. The path that led into the jungle was still there, shrouded in darkness, but Sophia didn't hesitate. She couldn't. She had to find him. She had to get to him before it was too late. Khan stopped at the edge of the trees, his nose to the ground, his movements cautious. He was searching. He was leading her, just like he had done before. Dara had always trusted the dog, and now Sophia had no choice but to trust him too. The jungle was eerily quiet as they ventured deeper into the night, the only sounds the rustle of the leaves beneath their feet and the occasional snap of a twig. Every now and then, Sophia would catch the faintest whisper of movement, and her heart would leap in her chest. Were the traffickers still following them? Was Dara nearby? The further they went, the more she began to doubt herself. What if it was already too late? What if she couldn't find him? The thought nearly shattered her resolve, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Then, as they reached a clearing, the faintest sound came through the air. It was soft, but unmistakable. It was a voice. Dara's voice. Sophia froze, her heart racing. Khan, ever alert, perked up, his ears twitching as the sound grew louder. "Dara!" Sophia called out, her voice breaking the silence of the jungle. And there, just ahead of her, she saw him. Dara was standing, leaning against a tree, covered in bruises and dirt, but he was alive. His eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, everything else faded. "Sophia," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. "You shouldn't have come back." "I had to," she said, her voice trembling as she rushed to his side. "I couldn't leave you out here." Dara took a shaky breath, his hand reaching out to steady her. "You should have stayed. It's too dangerous." But Sophia shook her head. "I couldn't. I need you." Dara smiled weakly, his face softening despite the exhaustion. "We're not out of it yet. We need to keep moving." Together, they stepped into the night once more, with Khan leading the way, but this time, there was no hesitation. No more running without hope. They were a team, and together, they would find their way to safety. The jungle seemed to stretch endlessly before them, but now, with Dara by her side, Sophia felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time: hope. Even though they were still in danger, still not out of harm's way, there was a strength in them, in the bond that had formed between them. Dara had kept her safe through it all, and now, she would do the same for him. Khan led them through the thick underbrush, his movements as fluid and instinctive as always. Dara, despite his injuries and exhaustion, followed closely behind the dog, his eyes scanning the path ahead, alert and focused. Sophia, feeling the weight of everything she had just endured, kept her hand firmly on Dara's arm, as if to remind herself that he was still here, that they hadn't lost each other. The distant sounds of the jungle, once so menacing, now seemed to be swallowed up by the quiet urgency of their escape. But that calm didn't last long. As they neared the edge of the forest, Sophia caught the faintest flicker of movement in the shadows, a silhouette that seemed all too familiar. Her heart clenched in her chest. It was them. The traffickers. "Stay close," Dara whispered urgently, his grip tightening on her wrist. Before Sophia could react, Khan's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. The dog's body went rigid as he stopped in his tracks, every muscle coiled for action. Dara immediately pulled out his gun, though the sound of it being cocked felt deafening in the stillness of the jungle. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see them yet, but the rustling of the leaves, the faint snap of twigs underfoot, it was enough to know they were close. The traffickers had found them. Dara's voice was steady, but there was a certain tension in it that made Sophia's skin crawl. "We can't let them see us. Not now." Sophia nodded, her mind racing. She could feel the panic creeping in, the familiar dread that had followed her for so long, but she pushed it down. She couldn't break now. Not when they were so close to freedom. Not when Dara was with her. Khan moved silently, staying low to the ground, leading them off the main path into the thickest part of the forest. Dara and Sophia followed closely behind him, their every step calculated, their every breath hushed. But even with Khan's incredible instincts guiding them, the traffickers were getting closer. Their voices grew louder, the harsh, guttural sounds of their conversation cutting through the silence. They were talking about the escape, about finding Dara and Sophia. They were confident they were closing in. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, the darkness of the jungle growing thicker, more suffocating. "Dara," Sophia's voice was barely a whisper, fear creeping into her tone. "What if we can't outrun them?" "We will," Dara said, his voice quiet but full of resolve. "We just need to get past them. Trust Khan." Sophia didn't respond, but she nodded. She had to trust him. They had come this far. She had to believe that they would make it. Khan's low growl stopped them in their tracks. He had sensed something, or someone, just ahead. Dara motioned for Sophia to crouch low to the ground, and without hesitation, they both dropped down into the underbrush, trying to make themselves as small as possible. Khan crouched beside them, his body still and tense, ready for whatever came next. The traffickers were close now, their voices clearer, more distinct. Dara's hand tightened around his gun, his body coiled like a spring, ready to move the moment they had to. Sophia held her breath, praying they wouldn't be seen. The footsteps grew louder. The traffickers were almost on top of them. And then, a crackling sound from the underbrush. A twig snapped under someone's foot. The traffickers froze. Dara's heart stopped for a beat. He knew they had been discovered. He knew that this moment could be the one that determined their fate. He gritted his teeth, trying to control the rising panic in his chest. He was ready to fight if it came to that, but his mind kept screaming that they couldn't afford a fight. Not with Sophia here. Not when they were so close to safety. He slowly raised his hand to signal to Sophia to stay quiet, to stay still. The moment felt like it was stretching until it felt like time itself was hanging by a thread. If the traffickers made the wrong move, if they were too loud or too careless. But then, Khan lunged. The dog's body shot forward like a blur, surprising the traffickers and knocking one of them to the ground before he could even react. The man let out a shout of surprise as Khan's teeth sank into his arm, forcing him to the ground with a vicious snarl. "Run!" Dara shouted, his voice sharp and commanding, the urgency of the situation flooding his words. He grabbed Sophia's wrist and pulled her up to her feet. "Now, Sophia! Run!" Without a second thought, Sophia followed him, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. She had no choice but to trust him, to trust Khan. Their lives depended on it now. The sound of shouting and the chaos behind them made her heart race even faster. Dara's hand was firm around hers, pulling her through the jungle, while Khan kept the traffickers at bay. The dog's growls and the sounds of struggling men filled the air as they sprinted toward the village, every step a reminder that they weren't out of danger yet. But they were close. So close. With each step, Sophia's heart began to lift, the crushing weight of fear lightening. She could see the faint outlines of the village ahead, the promise of safety just within reach. But it wasn't over yet. Not until they crossed that line. Not until they were truly safe. They pushed forward, not stopping, not looking back. The jungle seemed to stretch on forever, but every moment they moved closer, every second they outran the traffickers, they were winning. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia allowed herself to believe that they might actually make it out alive. But even as she ran, her mind couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when they reached the village? Would they be safe? Or would the traffickers find them once again? All she could do was keep running, one step at a time. The village lights were now a beacon in the distance, flickering like stars against the oppressive dark of the jungle. Sophia's lungs burned, her legs ached with every step, but she didn't dare slow down. Dara's grip on her hand was firm, guiding her, pulling her forward with a determination that matched her own. They were so close to freedom. Yet, with each stride, a deep knot of anxiety twisted in her chest. They hadn't outrun the traffickers. Not completely. Khan's growls echoed behind them, signaling that the dog was still holding off their pursuers, but Sophia could hear the sound of footsteps in the distance, growing louder. The traffickers were relentless. They wouldn't give up without a fight. Dara, we can't outrun them forever. Sophia's voice cracked, desperation creeping in as she glanced over her shoulder. The shadows of the jungle seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were closing in on her. We don't have to outrun them, Dara said, his voice calm, though there was a fire in his eyes that burned bright with purpose. We just need to get to the village. Help is there? We just have to hold on a little longer. But Sophia wasn't so sure. The traffickers were getting closer. The sound of their heavy footsteps, the voices yelling at each other, was growing clearer, sharper. They were almost on them. She looked back again, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the outline of a figure emerging from the trees. A silhouette, tall and menacing, standing in the moonlight like a shadow. One of the traffickers was ahead of them. Dara! Sophia gasped, her heart racing. We're trapped. But Dara didn't falter. He didn't even hesitate. With a quick motion, he pulled out his gun, pointing it ahead, not aiming at the figure in front of them, but slightly off to the side. It was a calculated move, a diversion. Go! Dara shouted, his voice filled with authority, and in that instant, Khan charged. The dog had sensed it, the trafficker ahead was a threat, and without missing a beat, Khan lunged toward the man, knocking him off his feet in one swift motion. The trafficker shouted in surprise, but Khan didn't stop. His powerful jaws clamped down on the man's arm, keeping him pinned to the ground. Dara didn't wait for the struggle to finish. He grabbed Sophia's hand and yanked her forward, dragging her into the final stretch toward the village. The lights of the village were so close now. The houses, the people, everything that represented safety was within reach. But Sophia couldn't help but feel the weight of their journey pressing down on her. It was almost too good to be true. Could they really escape? Could they really make it? She pushed the thought out of her mind. There was no time for doubt. No time for fear. They broke through the tree line, bursting into the open. The village was just beyond them, the light spilling over the dirt roads, casting long shadows. Sophia could already hear voices calling out in the distance, the villagers emerging from their homes, their faces lit with curiosity and concern. But they weren't alone. Another trafficker emerged from the shadows, sprinting toward them. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. They weren't going to make it in time. Not unless someone intervened. That's when the sound of shouting echoed through the village. A group of villagers, led by the man who had found Sophia earlier, appeared in the clearing. They were armed, tools, makeshift weapons, anything they could find to defend themselves. And they weren't about to let the traffickers take another step forward. Get back, the man shouted, raising his weapon toward the approaching trafficker. The villagers moved in formation, surrounding the trafficker, creating a barrier between him and Sophia and Dara. Sophia's heart raced as she realized what was happening. The villagers weren't just going to let them escape, they were fighting back. Run, the man called to them. We've got this. Sophia didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Dara's hand, pulling him toward the safety of the village. The sound of chaos followed behind them, but they didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. They had to keep moving. The village doors were open now, welcoming them in. As they crossed the threshold, Sophia's legs nearly gave out from beneath her. But she didn't fall. Dara was there, steadying her as they crossed into the safe haven they had fought so hard for. The villagers quickly closed the doors behind them, locking it shut as they ushered Sophia and Dara into one of the homes. The walls were warm, comforting, filled with the scent of food and firewood, a stark contrast to the cold, harsh night outside. Sophia's breath was ragged, her body trembling from the stress, the fear, the exhaustion. She collapsed onto a nearby bench, her eyes finally allowing themselves to close for a brief moment of peace. Dara sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his expression soft despite the toll the night had taken on him. "We're safe," he said quietly, though his eyes were still alert, scanning the room, the windows, making sure they were truly out of danger. Sophia didn't answer right away. Her mind was still racing, her heart still pounding in her chest. She wanted to believe they were safe. She needed to believe it. But as the minutes ticked by, and the villagers huddled around them, whispering among themselves, a sense of doubt lingered. The traffickers wouldn't give up so easily. And then, just as Sophia was about to speak, the door to the hut creaked open again. Her heart stopped. Was it them? Had the traffickers found them again? But as the door slowly swung open, it wasn't a trafficker that stepped through. It was Khan. The dog's fur was matted with dirt and blood, his eyes tired but alive. He had made it through. Dara's loyal companion had survived, and now, he was here, with them, safe in the village. Sophia's heart soared, a smile breaking through her exhausted face as Khan padded over to her, his tail wagging weakly. She reached down, her hand trembling as she scratched his head, her eyes welling up with gratitude. The door closed quietly behind him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia allowed herself to exhale. They were safe. For now. The night passed in a blur of confusion, exhaustion, and quiet relief. The village, once a distant hope, now felt like a fortress of safety. Sophia lay on a thin mattress on the floor of a small room, Dara beside her, both of them too tired to speak, too weary to move. Khan curled up at their feet, his breathing slow and steady, a silent protector even in the stillness of the night. Sophia couldn't remember the last time she had felt this way, safe. For the first time in months, her body wasn't tensed with fear. Her heart wasn't racing with the constant terror that someone was coming for her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to sleep without looking over her shoulder. But in the early hours of the morning, the peace was broken. A sudden knock on the door pulled Sophia from her dreams, her heart skipping a beat. She jumped up, her breath catching in her throat. It was too early. The villagers were already awake, speaking in hushed tones outside their door, but the knock had been too sharp, too deliberate. Dara was already awake, his body alert, his eyes searching the room. He immediately stood, moving toward the door with the quiet precision of a man who had seen too many nights like this. He signaled for Sophia to stay back, and she obeyed, her heart in her throat. When Dara opened the door, the villagers outside greeted him, their expression serious but not fearful. They were holding something, a small bundle of cloth. Sophia's stomach churned. What was it? The man who had helped them earlier stepped forward, his face weary but kind. "We found something," he said in a low voice, his words grave. "Something we didn't expect." Dara stepped aside, allowing the man to enter, his eyes never leaving the bundle in his arms. Sophia's anxiety spiked. What was it? The man gently placed the cloth on the ground, unraveling it to reveal what was inside. Sophia gasped. It was a piece of paper. Old, worn, with markings in a language she didn't recognize. But there, in the corner, was something familiar, her name. Sophia's breath caught in her throat, and her hands went clammy. Dara stepped forward, looking at the paper, his brow furrowing. He recognized it too. "This paper," he murmured. "It's from the traffickers. This isn't over, Sophia." Sophia's mind raced. The traffickers were still out there? After everything they had been through, after the fight, after escaping, this couldn't be happening. It was too much. She felt the familiar, sickening knot of fear twist in her stomach, threatening to pull her under. "But how?" Sophia whispered. "How did they find us? We're so far from the city, from where they were." "They know you're here," Dara said, his voice tight. "They've been tracking you. They won't stop until they have you again." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Sophia's heart sank. She thought it was over. She thought they were safe. But the reality was that safety was just an illusion. The traffickers were too close, too persistent. "We have to leave," Dara said suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "We can't stay here." "But where will we go?" Sophia asked, her voice shaking. "We've run so far already. They'll find us anywhere." Dara turned toward the window, his face set in determination. We fight back." Sophia's heart clenched at the fierceness in his voice. She had never seen him so sure, so ready for battle. In his eyes, she could see the same resolve she had seen in Khan, the desire to protect, to save what mattered most. "But how?" Sophia asked, her voice small. "We're not soldiers, Dara. We don't know how to fight them." "We'll make them regret ever coming here," Dara said. "I'll get the villagers organized. We'll defend this place. We'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Sophia looked at him, the man who had been her protector, her savior. His resolve burned like a fire in the dark, and for a moment, she thought maybe, just maybe, they could win this. They had come so far. They had survived so much. The idea of giving up now, after everything, felt impossible. Khan shifted at her feet, his ears pricked, as if sensing the change in the room, his gaze shifting from one person to the next. His loyalty to Dara and Sophia had never wavered. His growl, deep and steady, sent a jolt of energy through her. They weren't alone. They had each other. And Khan, fierce and loyal, was ready to fight alongside them. Sophia took a deep breath, her chest filling with a new determination. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. "Let's do it," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "We fight back." The villagers, who had been gathered outside the door, filed in, each of them carrying weapons, from farm tools to hunting knives. Their faces were grim but resolute. They had seen the horrors the traffickers had caused, and now they stood ready to do whatever it took to protect their village and Sophia. Dara nodded at them, his voice calm but urgent. "We make sure they can't get past us. We hold this village. No one else is leaving. Not without us." As the villagers began to prepare, Sophia turned to Khan, who had settled beside her, his brown eyes watching her with a silent understanding. She knelt down beside him, her hand resting on his fur. "Thank you, Khan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've kept us alive. And you'll keep us safe. I promise." Khan's tail wagged weakly, his body still as a rock, ready for whatever was to come. The village was preparing for war, but Sophia didn't feel the same fear she had felt before. This time, they weren't running. They weren't hiding. This time, they were standing strong. Together. And somehow, Sophia knew they would win. As the villagers gathered their strength and prepared for the battle ahead, Dara, Sophia, and Khan stood united, their spirits burning with the fire of hope and determination. They had faced darkness, they had run, they had hidden, but now, they stood ready to fight back. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about taking control of their fate and proving that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and love could triumph. The fight wasn't over, but with every person and every ally by their side, Sophia knew they had a chance. A chance to win, a chance to be free. And as they took their final steps into the unknown, one thing was clear: together, they would rise. If you want to see more inspiring stories of strength, survival, and triumph, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Don't miss out on the next chapter of this incredible journey. Stay tuned for more amazing adventures.